But with us on the Yuma guest line is, I think, one of the best football conversations in the Bay. And I don't want to overbook it, but oversell it, I should say. But Jordan Elliott is fantastic, and he's really, really good. And I've enjoyed having him on my YouTube channel, and we've enjoyed talking to him a number of times through the years about just about all things Bay Area. He's a big Giants fan, but he's great on football, and he's with us to talk a little bit about a couple of the articles that he's got up at NBC Sports Bay Area's website on the offensive lineman in this draft and the defensive lineman in the draft that maybe fits for the Niners, and he's with us on KNBR to talk about it. Jordan, how are you?
Hey, Larry, I'm doing fantastic. It's draft season, and the Niners have a first-round pick again for what feels like the first time in ages. So it's been a fun process so far.
Yeah. Now, if people want to connect to you and follow you, maybe who haven't yet, outside of going to NBC Sports Bay Area's website, what's the best way to keep track of what you're doing and the content that you put out?
Absolutely. I put out what I can on my Twitter. My Twitter handle is @splash_cousin. I try to put out whatever I can on there. But beyond that, it's mostly NBCSportsBayArea.com, and there's a lot of other great content for other Bay Area sports teams as well. So we got you covered on all the bases there.
It is interesting. Every year in Mobile, it's like somebody emerges. Last year it was Quinyon Mitchell, the Toledo corner, who had a great All-Star game week, and he was fantastic. Eagles drafted him. He's going to start in the Super Bowl next week. Ladd McConkey had a great Senior Bowl week, and obviously the Chargers drafted him. And then the Rams, probably Les Snead found Braden Fisk, the Florida State defensive lineman, and he was phenomenal at the Senior Bowl last year. And he was a big part of the Rams defensive line turnaround, which all Niner fans hated to see. So before we get into your latest piece on the offensive line, let's talk about your last piece on the defensive line. The guy today who's just absolutely wrecking shop in Mobile is Walter Nolan. Let's talk about Walter Nolan for a second. This guy started at Texas A&M, transferred to Ole Miss, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about a run defender or a pass rusher. This guy's both, and really, really good numbers if you look at Pro Football Focus. What do you think of Walter Nolan? I mean, is he for sure going to be even on the board at 11 when the Niners pick, or is he shooting so far up the charts that he actually might go in front of them?
It's so funny because this time of year, I think it's so hard to get a gauge on where these guys really are going to go. And I think that the Senior Bowl is the first major event where you start to see a massive shift in these projected big boards from a lot of the experts and a lot of the people who are doing the scouting year-round. The Combine's the next one where we start to get, a little bit more information about maybe some of the meetings that they're having and the impression that they're having on teams. But with Nolan, it's just the guy is so explosive, and he has so many great physical traits, and the production was there for him at Ole Miss this year. He had a fantastic season. But when you're talking about a player like that, you're really talking about him just barely scratching the surface of what he potentially could be. And the 49ers have a lot of things going for them. I know they're coming off of a down season, but one of the things year in and year out that they have in the back pocket is having Chris Kosarek as their defensive line coach, as somebody who not only is proven at developing talent and really getting the most out of the potential of a lot of these guys, but somebody that can really elevate a player coming into a newer system. Like, not everybody is going to play in this aggressive upfield wide nine scheme that the 49ers run. And Nolan, to me, feels like a guy where with that explosive get off and that quick first step that he has, he really seamlessly could slide in and make an impact from day one. And I think when you're talking about having the 11th overall pick, when you're having this aging roster and you're having this window to compete that the Niners are in, where it feels like that window is getting smaller year by year, you really want to have a guy where you have the long-term potential of being a perennial Pro Bowler, but you almost need that instant impact right away. And to me, Nolan is one of these guys on the defensive line where he checks both those boxes.
What do you think? I mean, watching some of these all-star workouts just reminded me why Oregon was so good this year. They just have dudes. That Jordan Birch off the edge is 280 pounds, and he moves like a guy who's 250. People are comparing Derek Harmon to DeForest Buckner. Let's talk about Harmon. He went to Loyola High School in Detroit. Then he started at Michigan State. He transferred to Oregon. He's 6'5". He's 310 pounds. I think he led the nation in tackles for loss this year. What do you think of him? I mean, is Derek Harmon? Do you see Buckner there, and is Harmon going to be a high first round pick, or do you think he's more like a back of the first round?
So I'll preface this with Harmon probably has been my favorite evaluation so far. Like, if he
really,
of all the players that, kind of been floated around the 49ers right now, if he's available at 11, he's the guy that I'm sprinting to the podium to turn in the draft card for. I admittedly haven't really seen – I can see the Buckner comparison. I have a comparison that maybe might seem blasphemous to some, and it might seem like a stretch at this point in time. But I'll tell you, Larry, when I watch him, I see the 49ers potentially getting their own version of Chris Jones. And I think that's what makes him such a special player, where you can get this guy who really – if we're talking about the 2 Super Bowls the Niners lost to the Chiefs, all of the glory goes to Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes typically. But if you go back and you watch these games, the guy that made the most crucial plays in the fourth quarter of both of those games, and I guess overtime as well for the most recent one, it's Chris Jones. Without Chris Jones, the Chiefs don't win either of those Super Bowls against the 49ers. And I think having that game-wrecking interior presence of a player like that that's able to just demolish guards and centers at the rate we saw Harmon do this past year for Oregon, it really is just the ultimate ace in the hole. Having Nick Bosa and having good players off the edge always is going to be a benefit. But if we go back and we look at these defenses that have really been dominant elite units over the last 10 to 15 years or so, almost all of them have one thing in common, and it's having that really just, game-wrecking force on the interior. And I think Harmon is the kind of guy where he can be a perennial all-pro, and I do see shades of Chris Jones in him when I'm watching his tape.
Wow. I mean, that right there is just, I might want to draft him just on the Chris Jones comparison. I mean, Chris Jones is just, against the Niners in these big games, he's like Reggie White, Mean Joe Green, all rolled into one. The guy is just and he's so the tone setter. I mean, he's such the tone setter. I've seen him on the sidelines chewing out his line mates if he doesn't like the way the game's going early. And it's like, you know what? This guy's on the edge. I mean, he is really close to like losing control on the sideline. But that edge that he plays on, that emotional edge, I think is the fuel for their whole team. I mean, I think Chris Jones, I don't think they are near the team without him. I think he is the key figure on defense. For obviously Spags is wonderful, and they got some great DBs, McDuffie, whatnot. Bolton's a great linebacker, but come on, this guy up front, he makes every time there's a big play to be made, Chris Jones makes that play, and it's frustrating to watch. Michigan, let's talk about the Wolverines. They have Mason Graham, who's considered to be the best defensive tackle in this draft. Some of the mock drafts have Mason Graham falling to 11. Jordan, I can't really allow myself to even fall for that because I just feel like Graham is so good that there's no way he could fall to 11. But, you have Kenneth Grant, his tag team partner, who's 6'3", 340 pounds, massive, two-gapper. When you turn on the film and you watch Grant and Graham together, what stands out about either one of those guys? Because it's probably the best tandem in the game right now.
Absolutely. And yeah, I agree with you on the Graham aspect where he just seems like one of these just clean evaluations where the consensus around most teams and most evaluators is that he's just going to be a good player that's going to translate to the NFL. Don't overthink it. Don't spend time trying to rationalize why he should or shouldn't fall. Like he's probably going to be a top 5 pick for good reason. Like he's just one of those players where there's no such thing as a can't miss prospect, but he feels about as close to that as you could get in this draft class. And so I agree where I'd be shocked if he fell beyond really the first 5 picks or so, let alone to 11. But when I watch Grant, what really stands out to me is, like you said, he's massive. He's 6'3", 340, really good at eating gaps, great against the run, but he's really nimble for his size. And I think his lateral agility really stood out as well, where when he was chasing guys down in space, like I always am impressed when you see guys that are that big that can move that way. And I think that that's something that always is going to translate to the next level. You can always put on more size. you can always refine technique. But when you're that big and you're able to move with that weight and keep that frame while being that nimble, I really think that's what separates a lot of these guys as they make the transition from college to the pros. And to me, Grant is a guy where he may not have the pass rushing upside of a player like Walter Nolan or a player like Derek Harmon, which to me at 11, I'd like to have the complete package. But if they are in a scenario where maybe they are trading back or potentially trading up from 43 in the second round, should Grant fall that far, he is a guy where I think he does beef up the interior of that line. And as we saw last season, there were times where that defensive line on the interior was very susceptible to being ran on and to teams really kind of, as the game went on, wearing down that unit. And I think that having somebody who is coming in, who's young and has that size and is that agile, could really provide a boost to the interior of that defensive line.
You know, it sounds crazy that Kenneth Grant could be there in the second round, but it's such a deep year for defensive tackles that there's going to be a bunch of teams at some point considering a defensive tackle in the first round, and they're going to say, you know what, let's go and get this guy at this position instead. We'll get a defensive tackle later because there's so many of them. And that could cause some of these guys to fall down. I'll say this, too. I've had people say, oh, you know, they don't want Kenneth Grant. He's just another Mozzie Smith who's been in Dallas this year and was a first-round pick by Dallas. Kenneth Grant, I think, is quite a bit better than Mozzie Smith. Mozzie Smith's big, strong, fast. He was kind of freaky as far as his measurables, but he just never played near as hard as Kenneth Grant. Grant, you'll see at 340. I mean, he'll be making plays along the sideline. I mean, he really does hustle. How about the Buckeyes? The Buckeyes win the national championship. They're loaded everywhere you look. O-line, D-line, secondary, wide receivers. Buckeyes are almost like a pro team. They got Tyleik Williams inside. They got a couple guys inside, but Williams is probably their big star. Man, he looked good in the playoff. He was great against Texas. I thought he was totally dominant in the Oregon game. 6'3", 3.25", big boy, but very athletic. Tyleik Williams, tell us what you think of him. To me, he's maybe I think he's the best Buckeye defensive player.
Yeah, I think that he's a guy where, again, I think a lot of times these interior defensive linemen don't get the shine that the edge rushing counterparts on the same defensive lines get. I know a lot of people were really locked in on Jack Sawyer and some of these other players for Ohio State's defensive line during the playoff run. But if you turn on the tape, Tyleik Williams was just incredible. Like you mentioned, against Oregon in that game where they just absolutely thumped the Ducks, and I don't think anybody really saw that one coming. He played a big part in not allowing Oregon to really establish a rhythm offensively and operate out of that RPO-centric system that they ran that led them to be an undefeated team going into that game. What really stood out to me was he had a couple reps in the Texas game where he went up against Calvin Banks, who coincidentally a lot of people are discussing for the 49ers at 11, the left tackle for the Longhorns. And he just absolutely – there was one rep where he absolutely demolished him and threw him to the ground. And I just was stunned at the way he was able to physically dominate this rep against a guy that's pretty much, you know, projected to be a top 15, top 10 pick in the upcoming draft here. And so his performance against these really high-quality teams in the playoff and his performance against guys that are projected to be NFL-caliber talent, to me, speaks volumes about the kind of player he is. And I think he's kind of the similar mold where you might not get the pass-rushing production that you're going to get with maybe a couple of the other guys, but you're going to get a really, really high floor immediately as a run defender. And I could make a strong argument that he's the best run defender and has the highest ceiling as a run defender in this class. And I think that a lot of times it's very easy to get caught up in wanting that sack production, that pressure production, that you tend to overlook just how valuable it is to have a guy that's able to eat those gaps and free up those run fits for the linebackers behind him. So I'm a big fan of his game, and I think that he's somebody that could come in and make a instant impact from day one to whatever team he ends up going to in the draft.
Jordan Elliott with us on the Yuma guest line. We're talking D linemen in advance of the draft. Of course, it's Senior Bowl week and the Shrine Games tomorrow night. We're in primo draft season. Before we jump to the O-line, the freakiest guy in the draft is this Deone Walker from Kentucky. And and when I say freaky, I mean he is massive. We're talking about 6'7", 6'8", 350 pounds. And yet, if you watch Kentucky football, Jordan, and I know you roll that tape back and forth, They played him, as a one technique. They played him as a three technique. They played him as a five technique. They played him off the edge. I mean, this guy played off the edge at 350 pounds. He's that kind of a mover. He had 97 pressures, 15 sacks in his career in 3 years there in Lexington. What do you think of Deone Walker? I mean, it's a basketball school, but man, this guy is an absolute force and somebody. I don't even think he's in the best shape that he'll be in. Eventually, he'll get in better shape, and then he's really going to be a monster. But this guy's an edge rusher if he wants to be at 350.
Yeah, and it's just, this one I think is the highest risk, highest reward out of all these prospects we're talking about. Because if somebody is able to tap into those physical gifts and generate the consistency, which, to be honest, is probably the biggest red flag when you're evaluating him, is that he didn't really have consistent production. It felt like I'm never one to question effort when watching tape because I think a lot of times it can be hard to discern effort on that level when you're not in the meeting room, when you're not there with them week after week. But there's a clear discrepancy in the production that he was having rep to rep, game to game. And he had a great year in 2023. He had 51 pressures, but in this past season, his sack numbers dipped, his pass rushing production dipped, his pressure numbers dipped. And I think even just watching some of the Senior Bowl tape, like you can see there's a couple reps where it's like, this guy looks like he could be the best player in the draft. And there's a couple reps where you're watching where it's like, man, this guy looks like a day 2, a day 3 pick. So personally, I'm having a very hard time coming to an evaluation on him because I do think it's a big gamble for whatever team ultimately does end up taking him, especially if it is early in the draft, especially if it is a first-round pick. But like you said, it's really hard to ignore a guy that's 6'7", 350, that you can line up as a nose tackle and then on third down kick out. Like there was a rep where he was lined up when I was watching tape where he was playing 9 tech, and I'm like blown away. This guy's 6'7", 350 right, playing the 9 technique, and he steamrolled the right tackle. He bull rushed the right tackle into the ground and was in the quarterback's lap within 2.5 seconds. So I do think it's one where if a team really is confident in their ability to extract the consistency and the best version of him, it could end up being an absolute home run selection. But I think it's really hard if you're a team that's really banking on getting that, high floor immediate production too, because I can't confidently say that's something that I would believe he'd be ready to do from day one.
My favorite offensive tackle in the draft is this kid Anthony Belton from NC State, who they call Escalade, probably because he's the size of an Escalade. He's 6'6", 336. He started at Georgia Military Academy in high school and is from Tallahassee, and he's just an awesome player at 336 pounds and very, very great feet for a gigantic tackle. He's probably a second or third round pick. I think he's really, really good. What do you think, though? You highlighted, you have another article out, your more recent article on the offensive lineman that the Niners may be looking at. I think most people think they'll go D-line at 11, but they could go O-line. You mentioned Kelvin Banks. There's Will Campbell from LSU, very high IQ player. There's Armand Membo from Missouri, who could be a guard, could be a tackle, 34-inch arms. Daniel Jeremiah and Dane Brugler both have mocked Membo to the Niners at 11. There's Josh Simmons from Ohio State, who's, had a knee injury this year, only played 6 games. He started off at San Diego State. He transferred. Really good player. He's only allowed 5 sacks in 3 seasons. And then there's Connor Lee from Oregon, who just allowed only 2 sacks in 3 seasons. But he got just dominated by Mike Green from Marshall in a lot of the drills today. Of the offensive tackles, one, how likely do you think the Niners go offensive tackle at 11? And who's your favorite of the 5 guys that you did the deep dive on?
Absolutely. I think it's certainly in play because if you're looking at the 49ers offensive line, I think that's probably the most polarizing position group when you're having discourse around the 49ers because a lot of people think that it needs a massive upgrade. A lot of people think that the unit's been pretty solid and there's issues elsewhere. And I think that ultimately it really boils down to how much of the 49ers going to prioritize planning for the future while maybe finding a role for a guy early on in the rookie season. And I say that because Trent Williams, who I believe is the best left tackle the 49ers have ever had from just a skill standpoint, a production standpoint, like he's a sensational first ballot Hall of Fame caliber player. He's going into his age 37 season. And as much as you'd like to believe that he's going to play for the next 2 or 3 seasons, I do think that it's something that you're going to have to start building a contingency plan for. And so if they are able to get a guy who maybe can slot in at that left guard spot where, Aaron Banks is going to be an unrestricted free agent, that's a position that's essentially going to be vacant until proven otherwise. If you can get a guy that can comfortably slot in, maybe kick into the interior for a little bit. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this class is a lot of people feel that these top prospects that are being talked about at tackle will actually profile better as guards on the at the next level. I know Membo's one of those guys. I've seen people even suggest that Campbell would be better as a guard as well. So I do think that there's a path to doing that, but I also think that it could be hard for the 49ers to be in this position where they have a premium pick if they don't feel that strongly that they need a massive upgrade at one of the guard spots, or if they don't feel that, Trent Williams is going to be leaving in the next year or two, then I could definitely see them pushing that pick to maybe a more important position, which I think we're arguing semantics at that point, but I do think that the defensive line might be a more pressing need at this point in time. But let's say hypothetically they do go with the offensive line. There's 2 guys. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you one, but there's 2 that I keep coming back to. And it's Will Campbell and Josh Connerly are the 2 that I like the most so far. I really liked Will Campbell did a film breakdown with Brandon Thorne, who in my eyes is probably the offensive line mind that I trust the most. Him and Brad Graham are the 2 that I lean on the most to learn about the nuances of the position, lean on their evaluations. And he did a film breakdown with Brandon Thorne where he broke down some of his tape, and just hearing the way he was able to articulate himself and what he had learned at LSU, how he had applied it, and that coupled with the production he had at an SEC school with the competition he was facing week in and week out, I could definitely see him being a guy that John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan and that 49ers brain trust really become enamored with over that pre-draft process. And then with Connerly, to me, he just checks so many of the boxes that I think you look for in a franchise tackle. He has the size. I think he has the agility. I think he's really good in outside zone, and I think that he's a guy that can really help unlock the 49ers run game, particularly, let's say hypothetically they were to take him. If they put him on the right side, I think that they'd have a much better chance at running to the right side than maybe they did this past season. I think they did get a little predictable at times where the most successful runs they were having were behind Trent Williams, and it got to a point where I think teams were really able to key in on that. So with a guy like Connerly, I think he is somebody where you could groom him to be the franchise left tackle once Trent Williams decides to hang it up, but I think you also could kick him out to the right side and maybe have a similar I would expect the same production because I think Tristan Wirfs is an incredible player, but that's what Tampa did with Tristan Wirfs. They had him on the right side, and then they moved him over to the left side where now he's, I believe, the best left tackle in football. Him and Trent Williams are kind of 1A, 1B to me. So Campbell and Connerly are the 2 guys that I would be I think the 49ers would be very happy if they're able to come away with either of them at 11 if that's the route they chose to go.
I mean, Campbell's one of the I think most premier prospects in this draft. I saw him squatting 6 bills the other day, and he's winking at the camera. He's like, wink, wink. I mean, the guy's a high IQ player. He's 6'6", 3 1/4. He's only given up 2 sacks over the past 2 seasons. He's playing in the SEC against all of the best rushers there are. On the way out the door, speaking of that, Mike Green from Marshall was just absolutely dominant this week. And I'll tell you the other guy, the Cal kid who transferred, he played middle backer at Cal and then transferred to UCLA, Olawufemi Oladejo. I mean, he looked outstanding in some of these pass rush drills. Did you see Green or Oladejo, and do you have a thought on either one of those guys on the way out?
I did see Green. I do think the conversation around Green is very interesting because I think the small school thing always is a problem during the draft, right? When guys play at a smaller school, he's playing at Marshall, the competition they face always gets brought up. I personally think that this is why it's great to have the Senior Bowl and these kind of all-star games so that you can see them against the premier competition that maybe people are concerned they didn't face week in and week out. And then it's the measurables. I know people are kind of concerned with the arm length and some of these other measurables. I do think that that's a very important part of the process, and I do think it's important to always consider when we're collecting, these years of data and which players did really well and how what percentile all these measurements, stacked up with, and you can really key in on a lot of patterns, and I think it's a useful tool. but I don't think it's the end-all be-all tool, Larry. I think that tape ultimately talks louder than any measurements can. And when you
Yep.
watch this guy, it's so hard to ignore that, like, despite all of these measurements that we're, being told are going to be a problem at the next level, it doesn't seem to be slowing the guy down at all. And so I firmly believe that it's one of those things that, again, you must consider it, but don't let it deter you from missing out on a player that could be special at the next level. And, man, when you watch Mike Green going up against some of these guys, when you watch his tape at Marshall, he looks like a guy that can be really special at the next level. So I'm very intrigued to continue watching him more and doing a little bit deeper of a dive into his tape.
Yeah, Marshall's MVP, Marshall's team captain. He started at Virginia. 17 sacks, not only led the nation this year, it's the Sun Belt Conference all-time record. He's on the Bruce Feldman freak list. He benches 380, he squats 440. I mean, the guy, and you could see it. I mean, you can see the strength. I mean, he just ran through much bigger, stronger, heavier guys this week and did it with relative ease. Jordan, awesome stuff, man. I know you'll be doing kind of a position breakdown, and maybe we'll get you back in a few weeks when you do a couple more of these. Thanks for jumping on KMBR and sharing some of your knowledge, man. We really appreciate you. And Splash Cousin on X for people who want to keep up with Jordan. NBC Sports Bay Area's website writes a number of great stories. Jordan, thanks again, man.
Thank you, Larry. It's always a pleasure. Jordan
Elliott, man, one of the sharp young media people in the Bay right there. That guy is fantastic. You don't see me touting that many people. I really don't. I mean, the only people I want on this show are people that I really want to tout. The people that I think are really, really good. If you're not really, really good, I don't want you on to be a guest on this show. I only want the best of the best for Niner fans. And, man, Jordan Elliott, fantastic. Really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you did as well.